Why you keep seeing 11:11 during difficult times. It started small. A glance at your phone at exactly 11:11, dismissed before it fully registered. Then a receipt. Then the clock on a wall in a place you were already struggling to be. Then again and again, with a frequency that stopped feeling accidental and started feeling like something was trying to get your attention at the precise moments you had the least capacity to understand what was happening to your life. What makes this pattern unusual is not the number itself. It is the context in which it keeps appearing. Not during stability. Not during the periods when your sense of direction was intact and the future felt navigable. It appears during the hard stretches, the ones defined by waiting without answers, by grief that doesn't follow a schedule, by the slow erosion of something you built or believed in or depended on. It appears when exhaustion has worn down the part of you that normally maintains composure, and what remains is rawer, quieter, and oddly more perceptive than usual. That last detail matters more than it might seem. There is a specific quality of awareness that emerges during prolonged difficulty. The psychological defenses that ordinarily filter experience become less rigid. The habitual mental noise that fills most of daily life grows quieter. Not because things are going well, but because the weight of what you're carrying has pushed everything non-essential to the periphery. What remains at the center is a kind of stripped attention, more sensitive to pattern, more responsive to coincidence, more open to meaning than it would ever be during comfortable times. 11:11 appears inside that state. Repeatedly, with a timing that feels less like chance and more like precision. This video is not going to ask you to accept anything on faith. It is going to trace the specific reasons why this number surfaces during emotional upheaval rather than during ease. What its symbolic architecture actually represents across psychological and historical frameworks, and why the moments of its appearance tend to cluster around the exact points in a transition where something internal is reorganizing rather than simply breaking down. The distinction between those two things, breaking down and reorganizing, is at the heart of what 11:11 during difficult times is actually pointing toward. And by the time this video reaches its final chapter, the period you are currently moving through may look fundamentally different to you than it does right now. Not because the difficulty will have disappeared, but because you will understand, with considerable precision, what it is you are actually crossing. When numbers refuse to stay silent. The first time you noticed it, you probably didn't think much of it. The mind is efficient at explaining things away, and coincidence is one of the most convenient explanations available. You glanced at the clock, saw 11:11, and moved on. But then it happened again. And again. And at some point, the explanation stopped being sufficient, not because you became superstitious, but because the frequency of the pattern began to exceed what coincidence could comfortably account for. This is where most people get stuck. Logic and experience begin to pull in opposite directions, and neither side fully wins. Logic says you are primed to notice the number because you've already assigned it significance, a self-fulfilling perceptual loop with no deeper meaning. Experience says something else entirely, because the moments of appearance feel too precise, too emotionally loaded, too consistently timed to the exact periods of difficulty to be explained away that cleanly. What's worth understanding is that these two responses are not as opposed as they seem. The mind's capacity for pattern recognition is not a flaw that generates false meaning. It is, in many contexts, the most sophisticated perceptual tool available. When a pattern crosses a certain threshold of repetition and contextual specificity, the rational response is not to dismiss it, but to ask what it might be reflecting. Scientists do exactly this. So do navigators, diagnosticians, and everyone else who depends on the ability to detect signal within noise. The question is not whether 11:11 is real. The question is what it is real about. And the answer begins with understanding why certain patterns register with such force during certain periods, and not others. If this number appeared constantly during easy, stable stretches of your life, it would carry no emotional weight. The fact that it surfaces repeatedly during upheaval is not incidental to its meaning. It is the meaning, or at least the first layer of it. What you are noticing is not superstition dressed in repetition. It is a signal emerging from a state of heightened perceptual sensitivity that most people only access under pressure. The next question is, why that state produces this particular kind of clarity, and what it is actually clarifying. Why pain sharpens the signal. There is something that happens to perception under sustained pressure that rarely gets acknowledged, partly because the dominant cultural narrative about difficulty focuses almost entirely on what it takes away. It takes energy, clarity, stability, ease. All of that is true. But prolonged difficulty also removes something else, something that most people don't notice losing until it's gone. The layers of habitual distraction that ordinarily stand between a person and their own direct experience. Under normal conditions, the mind is extraordinarily busy. It fills available space with planning, reviewing, narrating, comparing, anticipating. This is not a malfunction. It is the ordinary operating mode of a mind trying to manage a complex life. But it also means that a large portion of daily experience is mediated through those layers, processed before it fully arrives, filtered through assumptions and expectations, and the steady hum of background cognition. Difficult periods disrupt that system. When the weight of what you are carrying becomes significant enough, the non-essential noise begins to drop away. Not because you found peace, but because the cognitive resources that usually maintain it are fully occupied elsewhere. What remains is something rawer and paradoxically more accurate. A kind of perception that isn't managing or filtering or optimizing, just receiving. This is the state in which 1111 becomes impossible to overlook, not because the number is appearing more frequently than it otherwise would, but because the perceptual apparatus that would normally absorb it into background noise is no longer functioning at full suppression capacity. The signal hasn't increased, the interference has decreased, and what was always present begins to register with a precision that feels almost deliberate. This reframes the relationship between the difficulty and the pattern in a way that matters enormously. The hardship you are moving through is not obscuring the signal. It is, in a very specific and documentable psychological sense, producing the conditions under which the signal can finally be received. The pain is not the obstacle to understanding. It is, with considerable accuracy, the mechanism of it, the threshold symbol across time. Long before psychology had language for what happens at the edges of major transitions, human cultures were already mapping the terrain. Across traditions separated by geography, language, and centuries, a remarkably consistent pattern emerged. The recognition that certain numbers, symbols, and configurations carry the specific energetic signature of the in-between, not the place of arrival and not the place of departure, but the passage itself. The number 11 occupies a distinct position within this history. In classical numerology, it sits outside the standard sequence precisely because it cannot be reduced to a single digit without losing something essential. It is a number that holds two identical forces in parallel alignment, not merged, not opposed, but suspended in a state of mutual tension that generates its own kind of energy. Numerologists across multiple traditions have described it as a number that doesn't resolve, and that refusal to resolve is not a deficiency. It is its defining characteristic. In Hermetic and Kabbalistic frameworks, the doubling of any numeral carries implications of amplification and mirroring, a pattern reflected back on itself with increased intensity. The number 11 in these systems often marks the point where ordinary sequencing gives way to something operating by different rules, where the usual logic of progress and accumulation is suspended in favor of a different kind of movement, one that is less linear and more transformational. What is striking across these traditions is not that they all agree on every detail. They don't. What is striking is that they all locate the particular quality of 11 at the same conceptual coordinate, the threshold, the space that exists between what was and what will be, where the old structure has lost its coherence and the new one has not yet solidified, a space that is by definition uncomfortable to inhabit and impossible to skip. The double appearance in 1111 intensifies this further. Two thresholds mirroring each other, a gateway within a gateway, suggesting not just that a crossing is available, but that the conditions for it are fully aligned. What you are experiencing when this number appears during difficulty is not a comfort offered to soften the hardship. It is a recognition that you have arrived at the exact kind of moment these traditions spent centuries trying to map. Jung, synchronicity, and the architecture of meaningful coincidence. In the early 20th century, Carl Jung began documenting something that his patients described with striking consistency and that existing psychological frameworks had no adequate language for: moments when an inner experience and an outer event occurred in such precise and meaningful correspondence that the statistical probability of coincidence became almost philosophically indefensible, yet no direct causal link between the two could be established. He called it synchronicity. And his development of the concept was neither casual nor mystical in the dismissive sense of the word. Jung was a rigorous empiricist who spent decades accumulating case material before publishing his findings, partly because he understood that what he was proposing would be controversial, and partly because he wanted the theoretical foundation to be solid enough to survive serious scrutiny. The result was a concept that occupies a precise and unusual position. It takes the inner life with the same seriousness that physics takes observable phenomena, and it asks what the relationship between the two might be when conventional causality cannot account for the correspondence. Synchronicity, as Jung defined it, is not simply coincidence that feels meaningful. It is the simultaneous occurrence of psychic and physical events that share a common meaning without sharing a causal link. The outer event does not cause the inner experience, nor does the inner experience cause the outer event. Something else is operating, something that Jung associated with what he called the collective unconscious, the shared symbolic and archetypal substrate that underlies individual psychology. Within this framework, 1111 appearing during a period of inner transformation is not mysterious in the superstitious sense. It is precisely what synchronicity predicts: a symbolic pattern in the external world surfacing in alignment with a significant movement in the internal one. The timing is not accidental because synchronicity, by definition, does not operate through accident. It operates through meaning, through the precise correspondence between what is happening inside a person and what the surrounding world reflects back to them. What Jung's work offers the person who keeps seeing 1111 during a difficult period is not supernatural comfort. It is intellectual grounding. The experience has been observed, studied, and named by one of the most precise psychological minds of the last century. The permission to take it seriously was issued a long time ago. What 1111 is actually pointing toward. There is a distinction that takes time to understand, but that changes everything once it does. The difference between a sign of arrival and a sign of alignment. Most people, when they begin noticing 1111 repeatedly, unconsciously hope it is the former. They hope it means that something good is coming, that the difficulty is nearly over, that the pattern is a promise of resolution waiting just ahead. That interpretation is understandable, and it is also, in most cases, a misreading. 1111 is not a sign of arrival. It is a sign of alignment with a process already fully underway. The distinction is not trivial. A sign of arrival points toward a future event. A sign of alignment points toward a present condition, specifically, the condition of being in precise correspondence with the internal process you are currently moving through. Even when that process is painful, even when it feels directionless, even when you cannot yet see where it is leading. What this means practically is that the appearance of 1111 is not marking the end of the difficulty. It is marking the moments when your awareness and the deeper movement of your transformation are most closely synchronized. The number appears when you are most genuinely present to what is actually happening inside you, stripped of the defenses and distractions that ordinarily create distance from the process. This reframes the dissolution you are experiencing in a way that requires some time to sit with. What feels like collapse, the loss of familiar structures, the erosion of certainty, the disintegration of things you thought were stable, is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that a reorganization is in progress. And reorganization, at the internal level, always moves through dissolution first. The old configuration must lose coherence before the new one can emerge. This is not a metaphor. It is a structural description of how transformation actually works. The number appearing during that dissolution is confirming something specific, that the process is not random, that it has direction even when the direction is invisible, and that the disorientation you are feeling is not a symptom of being lost, but a symptom of being in the precise middle of something real. The anatomy of a spiritual threshold. Every culture that has thought carefully about transformation has arrived at essentially the same structural observation. Genuine change does not move in a straight line from one stable state to another. It moves through a third space that is neither the old configuration nor the new one, a space defined precisely by the absence of both. Anthropologists call it liminality. Psychologists call it the transitional state. Mystics across traditions have given it dozens of names, but they are all describing the same territory. The structure is consistent. First, there is a separation from the old order, sometimes chosen, more often initiated by circumstances outside your control. A loss, an ending, a rupture, a revelation that makes it impossible to continue inhabiting the previous structure as if it were still intact. This separation is rarely comfortable, and it is almost never clean. Things end in stages, not all at once, and the process of separation tends to be longer and more disorienting than anyone anticipates. Then comes the middle space. This is where the genuine difficulty lives, not in the initial rupture, which at least carries the clarity of a recognizable event, but in the sustained ambiguity that follows. The old identity, the old certainties, the old way of understanding yourself and your place in the world, these have lost their structural integrity, but the new orientation hasn't yet emerged with enough coherence to replace them. You are between, and being between is the hardest human position to sustain. This is precisely where 1111 appears most frequently. Not at the beginning of the rupture, when the event itself is still vivid and the shock provides its own kind of strange clarity. And not at the end, when the new structure has begun to solidify and forward movement becomes possible again. It appears in the middle space, the uncertain, formless, disorienting territory where the threshold actually lives. Understanding this changes the meaning of both the difficulty and the pattern. The confusion you are feeling is not evidence that the process has stalled or failed. It is the defining characteristic of the middle space, which means you are exactly where the transition requires you to be. The number appearing there is not a coincidence. It is structurally consistent with every documented account of what thresholds look and feel like from the inside. Why the sign intensifies. When you feel most lost. There is a specific quality to the deepest point of a transition that is difficult to describe from the outside, but instantly recognizable from within. It is the place where the fatigue has become comprehensive, where the questions have stopped feeling productive because they seem to cycle without landing, where the distance between who you were and who you might become feels less like a journey and more like an open wound. It is the place where people most frequently conclude that something has gone permanently wrong, and it is precisely here, at this lowest point, that 1111 tends to appear with the greatest intensity and frequency. This is counterintuitive enough that it deserves careful attention. If the number were simply a comfort mechanism, a kind of symbolic reassurance offered during hardship, you would expect it to appear consistently throughout the difficult period, distributed evenly across the duration. But the experience most people report is different. The appearances cluster. They intensify specifically at the moments of greatest emotional depth, as if the signal is not calibrated to the difficulty in general, but to something more specific happening within it. What is happening at those deepest points is not deterioration, though it feels indistinguishable from it. It is completion. The dissolution that began when the old structure lost its integrity reaches its furthest extent precisely at the moment that feels most like loss. The old configuration has given everything it had to give. The identity built within it, the certainties organized around it, the self-understanding that depended on it, all of it has been fully released. Not gradually and gently, completely. In symbolic systems across multiple traditions, this point carries a specific name and a specific meaning. It is the threshold crossing itself. The moment of maximum darkness in any genuine transformation is not the middle of the process. It is the end of one phase and the absolute edge of the next. The signal intensifying there is not offering comfort against the darkness. It is marking the precise location of the crossing. You are not at your lowest point because something has failed. You are there because you have arrived at the exact place where the passage occurs. The invitation hidden inside the pattern. At some point in the process of noticing 1111, something shifts in the quality of the question. The initial question is almost always oriented outward and backward. Why is this happening? What does it mean? What is it trying to tell me? These are natural questions, and they are not wrong. But they position the person asking them as a recipient, someone to whom the pattern is being delivered, waiting for an interpretation to arrive from somewhere outside themselves. The shift happens when the question begins to turn inward. Not what is this telling me, but what is this asking of me? The difference in orientation is significant. The first question seeks explanation. The second seeks participation. 1111 carries within it an implicit invitation to a specific quality of presence, and that quality is not passive reception. It is active inner listening, the kind that requires setting aside the noise of analysis and resistance long enough to register what is actually emerging beneath the surface of the current difficulty. Not what you wish were happening, not what you feared might happen, but what is genuinely moving inside you at this particular point in the transition. This is harder than it sounds, because the natural response to difficulty is to manage it, to push through it, to maintain functioning despite it. All of those responses are forms of resistance, useful in certain contexts, and genuinely obstructive in others. In the middle space of a threshold crossing, the resistance to dissolution tends to extend the duration of the in-between rather than shortening it. The passage requires a different kind of engagement, not force, but attention, not resolution, but recognition. What the pattern is inviting in each of its appearances is a momentary suspension of the management effort in favor of genuine internal listening. A brief willingness to be present to the actual texture of what is moving through you, rather than to the story you are constructing around it. This does not require sustained meditation or spiritual practice. It requires only the willingness, in the moment the number appears, to stop for a few seconds and ask honestly, what am I actually feeling right now, beneath the explanation I've been giving myself about it? That question, asked with genuine curiosity rather than anxiety, is where the threshold crossing begins to accelerate. The moment recognition changes everything. There is a particular kind of understanding that cannot be reached through analysis alone. It does not arrive when enough information has been accumulated or when the logical sequence has been followed to its conclusion. It arrives as recognition, a sudden internal correspondence between something heard or understood and something already known at a level that preceded the knowing. It feels less like learning and more like remembering, less like acquisition and more like return. People who have moved through major threshold crossings describe this moment with a consistency that is itself striking. At some point during the process, often unexpectedly and rarely at the moment they were actively seeking it, the meaning of everything they had been moving through became clear, not as an intellectual summary of events, but as a felt understanding that reorganized the entire preceding experience in a single moment of recognition. What had seemed like loss was revealed as preparation. What had felt like confusion was, in retrospect, navigation through terrain that had no existing map. What had appeared to be falling apart was the specific and necessary dismantling of a structure that could not accommodate what was coming next. The pain did not retroactively disappear, but its meaning transformed entirely, from evidence of failure to evidence of something being built at a level the surface experience could not access while it was happening. 1111 has been appearing throughout this process as a marker of exactly these moments, the moments when the inner movement and the outer awareness are most closely aligned. Each appearance has been pointing toward this recognition without delivering it prematurely, because recognition of this kind cannot be forced. It can only be approached through the accumulation of genuine experience, the willingness to remain present through the difficulty rather than circumventing it, and the gradual deepening of inner listening that the threshold process requires. The recognition, when it arrives, does not close the process. It opens the final phase of it. The crossing is not complete at the moment of understanding. It is confirmed by it. You were never lost. You were crossing. Everything that has been traced through this video, the psychological legitimacy of the pattern, the perceptual clarity that emerges under pressure, The symbolic history of 11 as a threshold marker, Jung's framework of synchronicity, the structural anatomy of genuine transformation, the intensification of the signal at the deepest point, the invitation to inner listening, the nature of recognition as felt understanding, all of it converges here. At the simplest and most significant realization, the entire process has been moving toward. You were never falling apart. You were being reorganized, and you were never lost. You were crossing. The period during which 1111 kept appearing with such precision and persistence was not a period of failure or collapse or divine punishment or cosmic error. It was a threshold, one of the particular thresholds that a human life moves through when the structure that has been carrying a person reaches the limits of what it can hold, and something larger begins to assemble itself in the space that the dissolution creates. This is not a comfortable process. It was never designed to be. The discomfort is not incidental to the transformation. It is the medium through which the transformation occurs. What the number was marking in each of its appearances was not the difficulty itself. It was your location within a process that has direction, even when the direction is invisible. It was appearing at the moments of greatest alignment between your awareness and the movement of the transition, which is why those moments felt charged, significant, strange, in a way that ordinary moments do not feel strange. The strangeness was accuracy. You were closest to the truth of what was happening precisely when everything felt most uncertain. The threshold is not behind you yet, or perhaps it is. Only you can feel where you actually are within the process. But the number appearing in your life during this time was never a mystery to be solved or a comfort to be accepted or rejected. It was a coordinate, a precise marker on a map of human transformation that is much older and more carefully documented than most people know. And now that you can read the map, the crossing changes. Not because the terrain ahead becomes easier, but because you understand, with a clarity that did not exist before, what it is you are walking through, where it leads, and why the most disorienting stretch of any genuine crossing is always, without exception, the one just before the other side comes into view.